program since COVID has hit. So we're glad you came. Pam Raes, as she said, is from the Phelps area. Dairy farm there. She's multi-talented. I know her best from being a guide at Deer Haven, and she never runs out of anything to talk about. She's always got more information to share. So, Pam, go ahead.
Well, he said it nicer than my high school teachers who said, "You ever stop talking?" But aside from that, so yeah, so to build on that, yeah, so you can tell I've had some experience giving tours at Rose Hill, and that's where I became acquainted with tonight's subject. No clue anything about tile drainage, you know, who would think about that, right? It's below the soil. And, you know, like the times when it was developed, it wasn't even talked about much in those times. My first experience tile drainage, I can recall my grandfather explaining the reason for the big puddle in my grandmother's back lawn was that the heavy equipment probably broke the tiles uphill from her lawn. Child, you don't think anything of it. Years later, working at Rose Hill, I learned about John Johnston, who was considered the father of tile drainage in America. So that brings us to, I will tell you my sources. Some things online. Also, this book was very instrumental, History of Tile Drainage by Mary and Mike Weaver. This was published in 1964, and much to my consternation, was definitely out of print, and no local historical societies had it. So I had to get it from the Cornell Library. Perks of working for Cornell. Another source was some text from Miles Manley, who I was like, well, who is Miles Manley? Because he was cited in this book. I'm going to find out he has the distinction of being the first professor of agriculture in the United States. Wow, how do you get to be that? Well, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that we actually started having land-grant colleges or colleges that dealt with agriculture as a subject. So he just happened to be one of the first people that was given that moniker. And he was from what's now the University of Michigan, was Michigan Agricultural College at the time, somewhere around 1865. So enough of the sources, we'll get right into it. Both gentlemen cite history. It's very vague. They say that, you know, there's some examples of tile or should I say, evidence that tiling was used going back as far as Egyptian culture, the Babylonians, the Romans. Much of what they've seen it was basically kind of just doing the obvious, like digging a ditch and draining things off the land, or digging off a ditch and draining off swampland and irrigation. So it really isn't the tile drainage which I'm really going to be talking about, but it is sort of the beginnings. Now later in the 1600s you see where there's some more accounts of people actually digging things up, and maybe like there was an example of a monastery in France that was reputed to have, you know, the most amazing crops, and things would come on early, and it was attributed to a series of pipe drains that were below the soil. So that's kind of the first one that I've heard about, because that's actually some sort of drain that's actually draining below, or under drainage as they like to call it. Some say that predated, there was the 1400s, and some say it was the 15 or 1600s. I really didn't do a lot of research to know which, but suffice it to say, somewhere around the 1600s, we actually have an example of a real under drainage system. Not much changed from those times, and I like how Mr. Manley put it in his papers. You know, things are always on a constant cycle of discovery and rediscovery. And you think of a time when people, you know, you don't have global communication, so maybe this farmer was using some kind of tile drainage, used it for a couple generations, and then it was forgotten. And so that was sort of, technology was sort of lost. So for ideas like this, innovations like this to become common practice, you have to have a few things in place. You have to have the people that perfect it and are, you know, excited about it. You have to have a means of getting it out there, and it also has to be something that people can do. It has to be affordable. And that's kind of why John Johnston and the crew in Seneca County really were the ones that got this movement for tile drainage going, because they were able to put it all together. But before we get actually into the rest of the history, just a little bit of the science behind it, because come to find out, the people that were using the drain tiles, obviously they didn't really quite know how they were working. First of all, they actually thought in some of these earlier drains were just trenches dug with stones lining them, or trenches dug with straw or elder or some kind of small twigs, anything over it to make a tunnel under there. But their thoughts were that the soil was going to percolate down into these structures and then flow out. But they didn't really have the concept of the water table. By Johnston's time, they are starting to get that concept of the water table. And you don't really want things to drain off. That's why the drainage ditches aren't great, because you don't want those soil nutrients to just, you know, flood out and leave the soil. If you're putting manure on top of the soil, you want it to go naturally into the soil, get into that water table so the plants can uptake it. So a little bit of misconceptions on how the drain tiles worked in the beginning. So some of the earlier, designs for the tiles were a little bit, were not quite what they were when we got to this point. These drain tiles came here with Mr. Johnston in 1835, but I'll get to that a little bit later. I guess getting back to the science. So why would we tile? We have some scientists in here and probably farmers, so you probably already know the idea that if your soil is too wet, those roots are not like straws. They are covered with what we call root hairs, and they're single or double cell layer, little tiny hairs on those roots. And the way that they survive is there has to be gas exchange in the soil for that structure to live. And if that soil is saturated with water, it's just like drowning. So if they don't get killed by disease, they will, in a sense, drown and die off, and then be completely useless. Other things you can factor in, if the soil is holding a lot of moisture, especially moisture right on top, it's going to be tilled a little bit later, right? You know yourself, my husband's always got this quandary. We can't get in that field, that's the frog pond. We can't plant this year. So your hopes is that you can get the crop in early enough, even if you have to wait, so that it can mature. And this comes into play with things like there was in, I don't know, was it 1853, there was a midge that was affecting wheat. And the folks that used the drain tile were able to get onto the land sooner, and their wheat crop matured before July 12th or something, and they were able to take that off, but the crop that was coming on later was destroyed by the midge. And I think that was one thing that really got a lot of people to take notice, like in Seneca County, was that. And of course, then the following year, there was a drought. And again, you might think draining soil in a drought, how does that work? But soil drain, this tile drainage doesn't just suck the water out of the soil. What it does is just takes off the excess soil. And if you leave in a clay soil, if it's constantly wet like clay, when it dries up it will harden like a brick, which makes it harder for roots to penetrate, and it makes it harder for those roots to go down and get closer to the water table, so that again, when it dries up, those roots are going to be shallow and that plant will die. And when the rain does come, it often runs through the cracks. It doesn't soak right into that hard-baked clay. So it's kind of very cyclic how this works scientifically. The whole process of having the soil be just right. And also, they've also did many studies, which I think was interesting because Mr. Manley did a lot of compiling of lots of research that was done. And oddly enough, like Dalton, who's one of the authors of the atomic theory, he actually did some research on evaporation of water from soil. So I thought that was kind of interesting finding that out. Okay, I know that was a bit nerdy. But the last fact about the soil being drained is you don't think about this, but soil that's holding water takes more energy to warm up. So in the spring, if you've got a wet spot, there's a really good chance, and again, there was a lot of research done, and they showed that between 5 and 10 degrees colder than well-drained soil. So there again, if you're putting seeds in, a lot of seeds have a very narrow window of temperature that they germinate. And if that window temperature is like between 6 and 7 degrees, your seeds might take another week or two to germinate. And again, like in the case of the midge, if it takes your crops two weeks longer to come to harvest, you can see where the problem lies. All right, so enough of the sciencey part. We'll get into a little bit more of the history. So I mentioned there wasn't a lot done not a lot of written history about drain tiles up until about the 1600s. And then in the late 1700s, you might see a paper here or there written by some agricultural society, in Scotland or England. There was a gentleman named Joseph, let me get his name again, sorry guys, Joseph Elkington of Warwickshire. And he claimed to have a secret method, farming method. He'd been doing it for 30 years, draining the land. And so Parliament was persuaded to purchase this secret for £1,000. And they sent a Mr. John Johnstone of Scotland in the Edinburgh area to go to the farm, learn the techniques, and publish a paper describing what was being done. He went out there in 1796, and John Johnstone from Edinburgh may or may not be related to our John Johnstone that we're talking about later. I was never able to find a connection, and I figured one of these authors would point it out if they were connected, but John Johnstone in Scotland, that's kind of like John Smith anywhere else, right? Probably a lot of John Johnstones. But anyways, so he went out, and the bottom line was this was very similar to what we had seen earlier on. No real improvement. It was, again, this ditch style with rocks or straw or elder twigs or green faggots, things just put right down, and then the soil on top. So not really a true drain tile system, but definitely drainage. That paper was written, published 1797, and a few years later that was read by our John Johnstone, the one that I talked about, the father of tile drainage. Now, young John Johnstone, he was born in 1791. He was one of 11 children. He was sent to live with his grandparents, probably because there was 11 children, and he claims that he learned everything he knew about farming from his grandfather, especially drain tiling. While on the farm, they had a lot of sheep, and John was often the one doing the herding, and during those times when he was herding the sheep, he was actually educating himself, reading pamphlets, flyers, everything he could about agricultural advancement at the time. So he was definitely very driven, and eventually, 1818, he meets his wife, Margaret Alexander. They're married, they have 2 children. Just before that, Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, so you're thinking of this time frame, and the prices in Europe started to drop. So it made the New World, as they called it, look very, promising. Like, this is a place you want to go. You might make a fortune here. So it was enticing, and John decided to come here. So in 1821, he booked a ship out of Glasgow, and on his way, little story about him, he's in the coach and he sees these fires out in the field at night, and he asked the coachman, well, what's that? And the coachman said, oh, they're burning the crockery to put in the ground. And he's like, well, I gotta check this out. So he stops the coach. The coachman says, well, I don't want to wait for you. He says, fine, take my bags up to the ship and I'll get there in the morning. So rumor has it that he actually spent the whole night watching these men make these tiles and kiln them right out there in the fields. And he walked to Glasgow to meet up with his baggage. But he was so focused on this. And this is where he actually learned a little bit about the kilning and the baking off of the tiles. Now, I read that some of the tiles that were made were either wrapped around a pole, or were what we call a shin bone tile, where the worker would actually take the slab and just right over their shin, like that. And then it would be set out to dry and then later killed. So a lot of the tiles were horseshoe shaped. Before, some people, stones were still accessible, but also there was a system where you could put a stone on the bottom and you could lay the stones like this, kind of in like a triangular fashion. But anyways, getting back to Johnston, so he arrives in New York City, May 1821, and he makes his way up here to the Finger Lakes region. Now you have to realize, or at least maybe you already know this, but I always like to point out the fact that really this area, especially during the time of the American Revolution and the very early 1800s, pretty much right up until the 1850s and 60s, was considered what we now call a breadbasket state. That term wasn't coined at those times, but in this area, most of the grain crops were grown, and most of them were actually being shipped out east. And that was one of the reasons that the Erie Canal was such a wonderful prospect for this area, because if you could get that very cheaply grown wheat out to the East Coast and sell it, and also sell it overseas, that was great. And that's one of the reasons New York City also became such a big port, was because of the Erie Canal. So in the meantime, that was another attractive feature for Johnston coming over here, because the prices were good, the land was cheap, labor was cheap, and you had the Erie Canal, which was almost completed. So you knew you had a way to distribute your goods. He did come to this area, checked out the area in Seneca County, loved the view. I'm not sure if everybody knows where the Johnston home is, but it's just like right up the road from Ventosa or Bottomless Brewing. And there's that big memorial to him there, that stone. He loved that spot, but he did go further west to Chicago. And he didn't like what he saw in Chicago, so he came back to this area. And he had relatives in Geneva, a cousin who was well established in New York City, so he really did decide on this area. And I think the cheap land was the big seller. But of course the land was cheap for a reason, because it was wet. It was clay loam, it wasn't great soil, there was the crops, the farmers that had owned it before really didn't own the land long. As a matter of fact, his neighbors said, well, you better prepare to starve, because the last guy on this land almost did, and they'd make jokes, dig your own grave, be ready, because you're not going to make it. But they didn't know John Johnston. John Johnston was not one to take no, and he was not one to give up once he had an idea. So he set about working this farm. He was going to send for his wife a year later, and he noticed there were piles of manure just stored in the barns. And well, he knew from his grandfather that manure was great stuff to put in the soil. And since labor was cheap, he had them lay 25 bushels per acre of this manure all over the soil. And they tilled it in. He planted a crop of barley, which did fail because it was too wet. Barley is a little bit more difficult to grow than some crops. But he did send for his wife, and they came over in 1822, his wife, some family members, and the 2 children. A little side note on that trip. They came up through Montreal, which was considered an easier route. And working at Rose Hill, you probably know the story about the Brig Thompson. It was run aground. The ship she was on was run aground on a small island of Anacostia, only inhabited by Aboriginal people, the natives there, and they actually helped take care of the people for the 6 weeks they were stranded on Anacostia. But in the meantime, Johnston was like, where's my family? He makes the 300-mile trek up to Montreal, only to find out that, the ship's been listed as, lost at sea. Well, Johnston's like, this is not going to happen. My wife's out there. I'm going to go find her. So he travels another 170 miles up to Quebec to find his family, only to find that they had been sort of rescued, and basically this legend is that the ships probably passed each other in the night. So while they were heading back to Montreal, he was heading to Quebec. But I think after about 2.5 weeks, they were reunited, family comes home, and of course the rest is history with that family, right? But they came home just in time to see the failure of his first barley crop. But remember, he's not tiling at this point. Right now, he's just working the soil and trying to get things going. And he continues to acquire land. He's very successful. In 1823, he has the most successful wheat crop that anybody's had on that land, and all of a sudden it gets the neighbors thinking, and the neighbors are like, wow, Johnston is lucky at farming wheat. And remember, without a lot of science behind what people were doing, people truly did think if you were good at farming, you were lucky or smart. So that kind of got him that notice, which again, when you're innovating things, you have to have notice. People aren't going to just listen to anybody. So that was kind of the start of that. Let me see, let me get going here. Sorry, there's so much to talk about. And he continued to buy more land. By 1833, he had about 306 acres. And this is the real thing that really surprised people. He got 2,700 bushels of wheat from 64 acres. So that's approximately 42 bushels of wheat per acre. Now, the clicker is, that was before the drain tiles. But it was his biggest harvest ever. So you think, well, how did those drain tiles get to be so big if his biggest harvest wasn't attributed to the drain tiles? But the thing with the drain tiles was there were many big harvests after that of corn and other crops, and it made the land consistently profitable. So if you purchase land for, I don't know, $25 an acre, you might actually be able to sell that land for $50 an acre because it was tiled. Because now the crops are more assured. So, you might get these really amazing harvests once in a while, but overall, tiled land was getting more consistently larger harvests. And again, when there was drought or disease pressure, those farms were doing better. So that was some of the selling point. But don't get me wrong, I mean, in the 1850s, even into the 1860s, there was a lot of opponents to drain tiling. A lot of people thought it was ridiculous and foolish. But not Johnston. He was definitely very determined. And that's when in 1835 he finally was able to import some tiles from Scotland. Scotland tiles came over, New York City, like most cities at that time, suffered a lot of fires. And this was like probably the 7th big fire they had in December of 1835. And Johnston thought his tiles were gone, but no, they made it. And just right around Christmas time they arrived, and he was able to put them in for the spring planting. The first tiles were handmade, and I think the first mount they laid was about 8 miles. So he did have a substantial increase in the cropping in that area. But again, it was a very slow start. He approached one gentleman in Waterloo who just really couldn't get the knack of making the tiles, and then he approached Benjamin Whartonby. Now, Benjamin Whartonby had just bought a crockery, pottery / factory in 1832, and in 1838 he was game to try it with Johnston. And so the two of them set about making drain tiles, because the other problem with the drain tiles, besides the skepticism, was the cost, right? So when they made these tiles handmade, it was costing them, $25 to $18 to produce 1,000. So that meant it really wasn't something that your average farmer was going to invest in. So the two of them set about finding a way to make them faster and cheaper, and they were able to get the price down with this machine they sort of rigged up to maybe somewhere around $12 a thousand, which was a little more doable. Now, in 1841, Johnston had acquired a neighbor, and his name was John Delafield. And he's actually kind of well known for agriculture history here in our area as well. And Mr. Delafield was very impressed with what Mr. Johnston was doing on his farm. And both of these men were members of the Seneca County Agricultural Society. Johnston actually was the president in 1844. But getting back to 1838, moving forward, Delafield was watching what was going on over at the Johnston farm, and in 1848, he arranges to have a tile making machine brought over, Thomas Scragg's tile making machine, and this came over from London. And this was a really big deal. Morton Beast Factory made 180,000 tiles the first year this came, and the following year 840,000 tiles. Which, of course, at that point, the supply exceeded the demand, but now people could see that this technology was cheap. You could get it, and it was affordable. And so here and there you start reading anecdotes about this one and that one, putting tiles in and having better crops. And so it started getting sold in this area a lot more than it had been. Let me continue, sorry. Yeah. So about this time, at the same time that the drain tile making machine has come over, and that is kind of booming, because by 1850s there were several drain tile factories in Waterloo at that point, because this was taking off. This is when Robert Swan comes into the picture. Now, young Robert Swan was from New York City. He had kind of a weak heart, and it was considered better for him to go into agriculture. Now, Mr. Johnston was well known in this area. His reputation was getting good, and he would often take in young gentlemen to sort of apprentice and learn farming techniques. Trouble was, Mr. Johnston had daughters, and they were getting at that age where you may not want to have a young man in your small house, unchaperoned. So he kind of got away from the practice, and a friend of the family said, really, take Robert, encourage him to bring Robert into this and to sort of apprentice him in farming. But Mr. Johnston was like, no. So under the guise of going to Niagara Falls, Robert and his father Benjamin stopped in and visited the Johnston farm. And Mr. Johnston immediately liked Robert Swan and said, okay, I will let you apprentice with me. So in 1848, at the age of 22, Robert Swan comes in apprentice with Mr. Johnston and learned some very good techniques. He was there for about 2 years. In 1850, he also married his daughter Margaret. And as a wedding gift, the neighboring farm of 350 acres, which we know as Rose Hill, was purchased for the couple. So again, 350 acres. In 1851, Robert started tiling in earnest. And again, the farm began to show, there's supposed to be an 11-fold increase in wheat crop the year he used the tiles. And so again, it was sold. So now we have some proof that this system is going to work. And we also have people in the position to sort of advertise it. And that's one of the things that Mr. Delafield was really good at doing. He was, again, a big voice for the Seneca County Agricultural Society, bringing in the drain tiling making machine, and he was able to get that information out there. And then again, it just started spreading. Now, it did not spread out to the west for many years, maybe like another 10 or 15 years, because they were very skeptical out in Illinois, Ohio. And it took a little while to break through there. But when it finally did, again, that's kind of part of the reason the homesteaders, well, of course you had to have the John Deere plow that could break through the sod. I think that was somewhere around 1839 maybe, my folks that know about tractors, right? Yeah, so it did spread out west, and then about that time, it's interesting because that's when everything moved out west, and then people thought you couldn't raise good crops in New York, you couldn't raise good wheat here, and so things kind of changed up. And let's see, any more interesting history about this area? So a little bit more, I had a lot of information about the ag societies and some of these things that, again, how they got this disseminated to the public. Mr. Delafield wanted to open an agricultural college. It was going to be on his land. He finally got the legislature to approve it. Unfortunately, he died within like 3 months of getting that legislation passed. So, like 5 years later, where Willard is now, that's where the first agricultural college was opened. However, with the advent of the Civil War, we lost all the men and it went bankrupt because nobody could go to college. And then eventually, we get our land-grant college at Cornell in 1865. Mr. Swan won, his farm was considered a first premium farm. He won awards for that again, and he attributed all to the tile drains. And that was a big thing. Again, you know, even when the experiment station in Geneva was opened, the first director, Sternvet, the community, the community didn't even really want the station to be there, but they thought it was going to be a model farm. So, you know, back then, that was the idea. Someone would have a model farm, farmers could come view it. Oh, this is how we should do it. Okay, we'll do this. But he really wanted to set it up as a research facility and have plots and research. And Mr. Swan and Delafield and all these guys are the ones that actually are the reason that we have the experiment station in Geneva, because they sort of kind of lobbied to get it here and they had some influence. So we're talking about the big four of tile drainage, as they call them: Benjamin Ortonby, John Delafield, John Johnston, and Robert Swan. Now, moving forward, we have some drain tiles here for people to look at. Different types. I don't have any egg-shaped types. These are called the horseshoe tile. Sometimes farms, now Johnston was a big proponent. He liked to, when the trench was dug, to actually put a piece of wood under the tile, which it was to be placed upon. Again, in the old days when they thought that the water was going to percolate down through, they had very particular ways of laying the tile, but as time went by they realized that the tiles would be, they don't have two of the same size, but they would be butted up against each other close enough. And of course you can see that there's a lot of imperfections in the tile. But when they're butted up, and of course I have two different size tiles, so that's not a good example. But when they're a little bit tighter, you still have a space for the water. So the water enters into the tile. Some can run down, but you pack the earth over it. Okay, that's how it was done. Sometimes they would use tar paper, but generally they would butt it up against, and the soil would be packed down tight, so it's not going to drain down in. Because if it drains down in, it's going to carry with it silt. And where is my tile that's filled? Okay, and you wouldn't want the tile to look like that. Okay. Now the reason this tile has silt in it is because this was a wash. So occasionally, if something isn't laid right, or over time, things, you know, heavy equipment will displace tiles that will actually break tiles, because of course this was made at a time when we didn't have big John Deere tractors, you know, we had very small tractors and horse-pulled items. But for whatever reason, if something disturbs this and you get a lot of water that comes running down through, it will fill it up and plug your tile, and it's kind of a wash. Getting back to, sorry I digress, but getting back to how this works. So they would place them, and I'm not really good at explaining how this is, but they would dig the trench and you'd have two guys trenching. So just imagine, the trench is a lot narrower than you would think. They didn't want to have to dig as much as, you know, they really had to break this down. So if you can envision sort of a V-shaped trench, there would be a little ledge here so that they could walk on it. And one guy would have a very interesting tool where he would dig. And the guy back here, so you'd be digging the soil, getting rid of it, or putting it up here. And then this other guy would be standing over here, and he would be laying the pipe, butting it up tight to the one other pipe. And now he was on the ground like this, the pipe's here, and he's packing the soil over it, and then he walks on it to further pack it. So this is how the process went, very slow. But again, labor was cheap, and that's how it was done. And then of course the rest could be put in. There's definitely a lot more to how that worked. You had to start, it was best recommended to start at the lowest point where you were draining, right? You'd want to start where you were draining, and then you'd want to work up, so you would have less of a chance of digging too low and having, you wanted that to be a nice, you know, steady grade down. And one thing, very important, is to cover the ends with something so varmints don't get in, and that's exactly how it was described, varmints, because obviously there was caution that animals would get into the tiles and not get turned around and plug your tile. Other things that can plug your tile, tree roots. Again, if the tiles aren't placed just so, they can wash out. And of course, as I mentioned before, heavy machinery, like if a tile is under what becomes a laneway, Heavy machinery will crack the tiles, break the tiles, and oftentimes that's why on a farm you will see a wet area. It's where something's gone wrong with the tiling. So you look further upstream to see where the tiling needs to be fixed. Now, modern times, I don't know a lot about the ditchers that they have. I've seen